wealthy rancher publicly humiliated a humble black cowgirl for her muddy boots. He had no idea she was about to buy his entire ranch in cash. The sharp laughter of Arthur Covington cut through the low murmur of the Dusty Saddle Saloon. He pointed a thick, manicured finger at Joanna Williams. "Well, look what the dust storm blew in," Covington announced to the room. "Shouldn't you be out mending fences, girl? This is a place for landowners, not hired hands." Joanna stood calmly by the entrance, her expression unreadable. She didn't flinch. She simply met his mocking gaze with a steady one of her own, a silent challenge that made Covington's smile tighten. He was about to learn a very expensive lesson. This story shows that appearances can be deceiving, and true power isn't always loud. If you agree and want to see justice served, smash that like button, subscribe for more incredible stories, and comment with your city and the word justice. The scene was set in rural Montana, a place where land meant more than money. It meant legacy, power, and respect. Joanna Williams, a woman in her early 30s, was known throughout the county as one of the most capable ranch hands around. Her hands were calloused from years of hard work, her face weathered by the relentless sun and wind, and her eyes held a quiet determination that unsettled those who underestimated her. She wore simple, durable clothes, worn jeans, a faded flannel shirt, and scuffed leather boots caked in the day's mud. To the wealthy ranchers who frequented the Dusty Saddle, she was practically invisible, just another part of the scenery. Her antagonist was Arthur Covington, the owner of the sprawling Covington Cattle Company, the largest and most powerful ranch in the region. Covington, a man in his late 50s with silver hair and a condescending smirk permanently etched on his face, had inherited his empire, not built it. He believed his birthright gave him the authority to rule over the valley and everyone in it. He saw Joanna not as a person, but as a symbol of the lower class he so openly despised. For him, her presence in a place where million-dollar land deals were discussed over whiskey was an insult. The central conflict was brewing over a piece of property known as Whispering Creek Ranch. The land, a pristine 5,000-acre plot with a vital water source, was set for public auction the next day. It bordered Covington's property, and he had made it publicly known that he intended to acquire it to solidify his dominance. To him, the auction was a mere formality. No one in the county had the capital or the courage to bid against him. He saw the land as already his, another jewel in his crown. But Covington and the others didn't know about the quiet years Joanna spent away from Montana. They didn't know about the tech patent she had developed and sold to a Silicon Valley giant, a transaction that had made her wealthier than anyone in this town could possibly imagine. They were also completely unaware of the old, forgotten promise tied to the Whispering Creek Ranch, a promise made to her grandfather, a sharecropper who had worked that very land and was cheated out of his share decades ago by Covington's own father. For Joanna, this wasn't about business. It was about reclaiming her family's honor. The whispers in the saloon died down as Covington took a step toward her. His cronies, other wealthy ranchers, chuckled in anticipation. "This auction tomorrow," Covington said loudly, ensuring everyone could hear. "It's a big boys' game, Joanna. You wouldn't have enough money to buy the front gate, let alone the pasture. Go home and clean your boots." He expected her to shrink away in shame, to retreat from the world she didn't belong in. Instead, a slow, knowing smile spread across Joanna's lips. It was a smile that held the weight of a secret fortune and the promise of imminent revenge. Covington thought he was putting a poor ranch hand in her place. He was about to find out he was picking a fight with a force of nature. How does a man react when the very ground he stands on is bought out from under him? Joanna held Covington's gaze for a long moment. The entire saloon was silent, watching. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. "We'll see tomorrow, won't we, Mr. Covington?" she said, her voice low and even. She then turned, not with the hurried retreat of someone shamed, but with the deliberate pace of someone with an appointment to keep. She pushed the swinging doors open and disappeared into the twilight. leaving a room full of confused and whispering ranchers behind. Covington's face was a mask of fury and disbelief. He had expected tears or anger. He hadn't expected calm, unwavering confidence. It unnerved him more than any outburst could have. "Get back to your drinks," he snarled at the room. But the mood was broken. A seed of doubt had been planted. Joanna didn't go home to a large house or a comfortable apartment. She lived in a small, meticulously kept cabin on a rented plot of land at the edge of the county. It was the same cabin her grandfather, Samuel Williams, had lived in decades ago. Inside, the rustic exterior gave way to a surprisingly modern setup. A powerful laptop sat on a simple wooden desk, and satellite internet equipment was discreetly mounted near the window. Her life was a study in contrasts: the muddy boots by the door, the multi-million-dollar stock portfolio on the screen. She ignored the computer for now. Instead, she pulled a worn, leather-bound photo album from a chest at the foot of her bed. She flipped to a black and white photograph of a proud, strong man with kind eyes, his arm around a much younger Joanna. Her grandfather. He had worked the Whispering Creek Ranch his entire life for Covington's father, old man Harrison Covington. He wasn't just a worker, he was a partner, promised a deed to 100 acres of that land in exchange for his tireless labor and innovative irrigation techniques that saved the ranch during a historic drought. The promise was verbal, a gentleman's agreement. But when Harrison Covington died, Arthur inherited everything and claimed no such agreement ever existed. He threw Samuel off the land with nothing but a final paycheck. The injustice had broken her grandfather's spirit, and he passed away a few years later, his final words to Joanna being, "That land has a memory, child. It remembers who treated it right." This wasn't just about embarrassing Arthur Covington. This was about fulfilling a legacy. The tech patent she developed was based on agricultural sensor technology, an idea born from her grandfather's teachings about soil and water. She had used his wisdom to build her fortune, and now she would use that fortune to reclaim his honor. She closed the album, her resolve hardening like steel. Covington saw a poor cowgirl. He had no idea he was facing the ghost of a promise his own family had broken. Meanwhile, back at his opulent ranch house, Arthur Covington poured himself a stiff bourbon. His foreman, a nervous man named Bill, stood shifting his weight by the door. "Everything all right, boss?" Bill asked. Covington slammed the glass down on his mahogany desk. "It's that Williams girl. The nerve of her looking at me like that in front of everyone." Bill hesitated. "Folks are talking, saying she's got something up her sleeve." Covington laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "What could she have? A few $100s saved up? She's a nobody." Her grandfather was a nobody. The Williams family is dust. But his bravado was a thin veil over a deep-seated anxiety. The truth was, his finances were stretched thin. A series of bad investments and his own extravagant lifestyle had put the Covington Cattle Company in a precarious position. He needed Whispering Creek Ranch. Its water rights were the only thing that would keep his operation profitable in the coming years without taking on massive debt. The auction wasn't just about expanding his empire, it was about saving it from crumbling. He needed this win to be public and absolute, to quell any rumors of his financial instability. Joanna's quiet defiance felt like a direct threat to that. "Make sure our banker is ready tomorrow, Bill," Covington ordered. "I want to start the bidding high. Crush any hope before it even begins." Bill nodded and left, leaving Covington alone with his drink and his growing unease. As night fell over the valley, Joanna stood on her small porch, looking out in the direction of Whispering Creek. Her phone buzzed. It was a text from her financial advisor in San Francisco. It read, "Funds confirmed. Ready for wire transfer on your command." She typed a simple reply, "Thank you." She wasn't just buying a ranch, she was buying back a piece of her family's soul. Tomorrow, the valley would learn that the deepest pockets don't always belong to the loudest man in the room. The morning of the auction was bright and cold. The event was held on the steps of the old county courthouse, a symbol of local law and order. A crowd of about 50 people had gathered, ranchers, townsfolk, and a few local journalists who smelled a story, even if it was just Covington formally adding to his empire. Arthur Covington arrived in a gleaming black SUV, stepping out in a tailored western suit and polished ostrich boots. He was flanked by his foreman, Bill, and a man in a crisp suit who was clearly his banker. Covington moved through the crowd like a king, shaking a few hands, his smile wide and confident. He was performing, assuring everyone that the day's outcome was preordained. Joanna arrived 5 minutes later on foot. She wore the same clothes as the day before, though she'd brushed the worst of the mud from her boots. She carried no briefcase, had no entourage. She simply found a spot at the edge of the crowd, her presence so unassuming that many didn't even notice her at first. Covington saw her, though. He shot her a dismissive smirk and turned his back, a final public dismissal. The auctioneer, a fast-talking man named Henderson, cleared his throat and began. "All right, folks. We're here today for the sale of the Whispering Creek Ranch. 5,000 acres, prime grazing land with full water rights to the creek. A beautiful piece of Montana. We'll start the bidding at $2 million. Before Henderson could even ask for an opening bid, Covington's hand shot up. $3 million, he boomed, his voice echoing off the courthouse walls. A collective gasp went through the crowd. He hadn't just started the bidding, he had thrown down a gauntlet meant to shatter any opposition. The price was already well over the land's appraised value. Henderson looked around, a little stunned himself. "I have $3 million from Mr. Covington. Do I hear $3,100,000? Silence. The other ranchers shuffled their feet, looking at the ground. This was Covington's show. "Going once," Henderson called out. "Going twice." A single calm voice cut through the silence. $3,200,000. Every head snapped in the direction of the voice. It was Joanna. She hadn't raised her hand. Just a simple numbered paddle she'd registered with earlier. Her expression was placid, as if she were bidding on a piece of furniture. Covington spun around, his face turning a shade of purple. The crowd erupted in frantic whispers. "I must have misheard," Covington said, his voice dripping with venom. "Did the hired hand just speak?" "The bid is $3,200,000, Joanna said, looking directly at the auctioneer, completely ignoring Covington. Henderson, recovering his professional composure, nodded. "The bid is 3-2 from bidder number 74. Covington's face contorted in a sneer. $4 million, he yelled, the number exploding from him. He was trying to end this farce immediately. Without a moment's hesitation, Joanna replied, $4,500,000. The back and forth was instantaneous, a volley of numbers that left the crowd dizzy. Covington would shout a number, and Joanna would calmly, immediately top it. The bidding rocketed past $5 million, then $6 million. The land wasn't worth this much. Everyone knew it. This was no longer an auction. It was a duel. Covington was sweating now, his confident facade cracking with every counterbid. He turned to his banker, whispering furiously. The banker looked pale, shaking his head slightly. $7 million, Covington roared, his voice hoarse. He was gambling everything now. $7,500,000, Joanna said, her voice as steady as a rock. Covington looked like he was going to have a stroke. Who the hell do you think you are? He hissed at her. Joanna finally turned her head and looked at him. For the first time, her eyes showed a flicker of something other than calm, cold, hard satisfaction. I'm my grandfather's granddaughter, she said softly, but her words carried the weight of a freight train. The banker grabbed Covington's arm. Arthur, you can't. The bank won't cover it. We're already overextended. Covington shook him off, his eyes wild. He was trapped. To back down now, in front of the entire county, would be a humiliation from which he would never recover. To continue would mean financial ruin. He made his choice. $8 million. The crowd was dead silent. It was an insane number. Joanna didn't even wait for the auctioneer. $10 million. The number hung in the air, absolute and final. It wasn't a bid. It was a judgment. Covington staggered back as if he'd been physically struck. The fight drained out of him, replaced by a grey, hollow look of utter defeat. He stared at Joanna, not with hatred anymore, but with a dawning, horrified understanding. He had been played, dismantled, and destroyed. "Going once," Henderson said, his voice trembling slightly. "Going twice. Sold. For $10 million to bidder number 74. As the crowd began to buzz with shocked excitement, Joanna walked calmly toward the auctioneer's table to sign the papers. Behind her, she could hear Covington's banker speaking in a low, panicked tone to his client. "It's over, Arthur. The bank will call in your loans. With this debt, you'll lose everything. The main ranch. Everything." Joanna paused, her pen hovering over the contract. An idea, far more ambitious and devastating than just buying Whispering Creek, began to form in her mind. Her revenge was only half complete. Joanna signed the last document with a steady hand and pushed the papers back toward the auctioneer. She pulled out her phone, tapped the screen a few times, and showed the confirmation to Henderson. "The wire transfer for the full $10 million is complete," she said, her voice clear and professional. Henderson's eyes widened as he saw the transaction receipt. This was real. The crowd, which had pressed closer to witness the finality of the moment, murmured in astonishment. As Joanna turned to leave, Covington blocked her path. His face was pale, his eyes bloodshot. The public mask of the powerful rancher had crumbled, leaving behind a desperate, confused man. "Where?" he choked out, his voice barely a whisper. "Where did a person like you get that kind of money?" Joanna looked at him, not with pity, but with an unnerving lack of any emotion at all. "I earned it, Mr. Covington, something your family has very little experience with." She stepped around him without a second glance and walked away, leaving him standing alone and humiliated on the courthouse steps. The crowd parted for her, looking at her now with a mixture of awe and fear. She was no longer just Joanna the Cowgirl. She was a force that had just toppled a dynasty. She didn't go far. She saw Covington's banker, a man named Davies, trying to discreetly guide his imploding client to his car. Joanna intercepted him near the edge of the parking lot. "Mr. Davies?" she said. Davies looked startled. "Miss Williams, a surprising day." "It's about to get more surprising," Joanna said, her tone all business. "I overheard your conversation with Mr. Covington. The bank is going to call in his loans. He's over-leveraged and just publicly proved he has no liquid assets to cover his debts." Davies stiffened. "I can't discuss a client's financial situation." "You don't have to," Joanna continued, unfazed. "I'm not asking about his situation. I'm offering a solution to yours. Your bank is now tied to a failing asset. A long, messy foreclosure will cost you time and money. I, on the other hand, have a great deal of capital and an interest in local acquisitions." A flicker of understanding and greed appeared in the banker's eyes. "What are you proposing?" "I'm proposing to buy the debt," Joanna stated plainly. "All of it. The mortgages on the Covington Cattle Company, the equipment loans, the lines of credit, everything. I will wire the full principal amount to your bank by the end of the business day. You get a toxic loan off your books, and I become the sole creditor to Arthur Covington." Davies was speechless. This wasn't just buying a neighboring ranch anymore. This was a corporate takeover executed on a courthouse lawn. It was ruthless, brilliant, and completely unexpected. He looked from the powerful, calm woman in front of him to the broken man being helped into his SUV. The bank's first duty was to itself. I will need to speak with my board," he stammered, "but a cash offer of that magnitude, it would certainly be given serious consideration." "You have 1 hour to get their approval," Joanna said, her voice leaving no room for negotiation. "After that, the offer is off the table." She turned and walked to her old, dusty pickup truck, got in, and drove away, leaving the banker staring after her, his mind reeling. News of the auction spread through the valley like a wildfire. At the Dusty Saddle Saloon, the mood was electric. Covington's cronies, who had been laughing at Joanna the night before, were now huddled in a corner, speaking in hushed tones. Bill, the foreman, sat alone at the bar, nursing a beer. He'd received a single frantic call from Covington, full of curses and accusations, before the line went dead. He knew his job, and likely the entire ranch as he knew it was gone. Back at his sprawling ranch house, Arthur Covington paced his study like a caged animal. The call from Davies came 45 minutes later. It was short and brutal. The bank had accepted a private offer to sell his entire debt portfolio. He was no longer in debt to the bank. He was in debt to Joanna Williams. She now owned him. She held the deed to his family's legacy. He swept everything off his massive desk in a fit of rage. Papers, whiskey glasses, and a framed photo of his father all crashed to the floor. His empire, built on a foundation of arrogance and a broken promise, had been conquered in a single morning. Joanna didn't return to her cabin. She drove the long, winding road to the entrance of Whispering Creek Ranch. She stopped the truck and got out, the engine ticking in the quiet air. She walked to the gate and rested her calloused hands on the weathered wood. This was it, the land her grandfather had loved, the land he had been cheated out of. She looked out over the rolling hills and the creek glistening in the distance. It wasn't about the money, it was about this. A quiet sense of justice settled over her, deep and satisfying. But it wasn't over. Owning this land was the first step. Owning the man who had wronged her family was the last. She pulled out her phone and made a call. "It's done," she said. "Prepare the paperwork for the Covington Cattle Company. I'm taking possession." The next morning, Joanna didn't drive to Whispering Creek. She drove to the main gate of the Covington Cattle Company. The grand, wrought-iron archway, bearing the arrogant C logo, had always been a symbol of untouchable power in the valley. Joanna got out of her truck, unlatched the heavy gate herself, and drove through. She didn't bother closing it behind her. She pulled up directly in front of the massive ranch house, a sprawling log and stone mansion that looked more like a luxury resort than a home. The front door flew open and Arthur Covington stormed out onto the porch. He was a shadow of the man from the auction. He was unshaven, his expensive suit was rumpled, and his eyes were wild with a mixture of sleeplessness and rage. "Get out!" he snarled, his voice a ragged growl. "You are trespassing. This is private property." Joanna killed the engine and stepped out of her truck, moving with an unhurried grace that seemed to infuriate him even more. She stopped at the bottom of the porch steps and looked up at him. "I know it's private property, Mr. Covington," she said, her voice calm and level. "As of 8 a.m. this morning, when my legal team filed the notice of default, it became my private property." Covington stared at her, his mind struggling to process the words. "You can't. The law. There are procedures, months of them." "There are," Joanna agreed, "for a bank. But a private creditor who has acquired the entirety of a business's debt, including assets pledged as collateral, can dictate terms. And my terms are immediate possession. You defaulted the moment you couldn't cover your bid yesterday. Your banker confirmed you have no other assets. The company is insolvent. It's over." Each word was a hammer blow, dismantling the last of his denial. He sagged against a porch column, the fight visibly draining from him. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice now weak, pathetic. "You've won. You have the land. You've humiliated me. What more could you possibly want?" "I want to offer you a job," Joanna said. The statement was so absurd, so completely out of left field, that Covington could only stare at her in stunned silence. He started to laugh, a broken, hysterical sound. "A job? You want to offer me a job?" "I do," she said, her expression unchanging. "I now own the largest cattle operation in the state. I know the land, I know the work, but I don't know all the day-to-day operations of a business this size. You do. I'm keeping on most of your staff, starting with your foreman, Bill. I'm offering you a position as a ranch hand. You'll be paid a standard wage. You'll answer to Bill. You can live in the foreman's old bunkhouse, not this house. This house is being closed. This was the final, devastating stroke. She wasn't just taking his land and his money. She was stripping him of his name, his status, and his pride, offering him the very life he had mocked her for. He would be a hired hand on the land his family had ruled for generations. He would take orders from a man who once took orders from him. He would wear muddy boots and mend fences, just as he had jeered at her for doing. It was a perfectly crafted, soul-crushing revenge. "You're insane," he whispered, shaking his head in disbelief. "It's a practical offer," Joanna replied. "You have two choices. You can accept the job, or you can take your personal belongings and be off this property by sundown. The choice is yours." She didn't wait for an answer. She turned and saw Bill pulling up in a work truck, his face etched with worry. He got out and looked nervously between Joanna and the broken man on the porch. "Miss Williams," he began. "It's Joanna," she corrected him gently. "Bill, I'd like you to stay on as foreman. Your pay is getting a 20% raise, effective immediately. Same goes for the rest of the crew. We're going to be very busy." Bill's jaw dropped. "Really? Yes, ma'am. Joanna, thank you." "Good," she said. "Your first job is to get a full inventory of the livestock and equipment. I want the report on my desk by the end of the week." She gestured toward the main house. "And Mr. Covington will be your new ranch hand, should he choose to accept the position. You'll be his boss. Show him to the bunkhouse if he says yes. If he says no, escort him to the gate." She walked past Covington on the porch, entering the house for the first time. She didn't look at him. She didn't need to. Her victory was absolute. As she stepped into the grand foyer, leaving the two men outside to process the new world order, she ran a hand along the polished wood of the banister. This was more than a house. It was a monument to a family's arrogance. And now, it was hers. The real work was just beginning. Outside on the grand porch, an agonizing silence stretched between the two men. Bill, the new foreman, looked at the man who had been his boss for 20 years. He saw not a tyrant, but a shattered shell. He cleared his throat, the sound unnaturally loud. "Arthur, what are your plans?" Covington didn't look at him. He stared out at the vast expanse of land that was no longer his land, his father's land. He had no money, no allies, and no home. His so-called friends from the saloon would cross the street to avoid him now. He had two choices: walk away into nothingness or endure the ultimate humiliation. To walk away would be to die. To stay was a different kind of death, a slower one, but it was survival. He finally turned his head, his eyes meeting Bill's. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a hollow, desperate emptiness. "Show me to the bunkhouse, Bill," he said, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. Bill simply nodded, a flicker of pity in his eyes that was almost worse than contempt. "This way, Arthur." He led the former king of the valley away from his mansion, toward the simple, rough-hewn building where the real work was done. Inside the house, Joanna moved through the cavernous living room, her worn boots silent on the plush oriental rugs. The walls were covered with hunting trophies and expensive art. The air was thick with the smell of old money and leather. It felt cold, impersonal, a museum to one family's ego. She ignored it all, walking straight to the study. The room was a disaster, papers strewn everywhere, a broken whiskey bottle on the floor, its contents staining a priceless rug. On the floor lay the smashed frame containing the portrait of Harrison Covington. Joanna picked it up and looked at the stern, proud face of the man who had broken his promise to her grandfather. She felt nothing, no anger, no triumph, just a quiet finality. She walked to the wall behind the desk, which was dominated by a massive, oil-painted portrait of Arthur Covington himself, posing with a prize-winning bull. Without hesitation, she lifted it off its hook. It was heavy, ostentatious. She leaned it against the wall, face down. One by one, she began taking down the other Covington family portraits that lined the halls. She wasn't smashing them or defacing them. She was simply erasing them. She had her staff stack them carefully in a storage room in the basement. This house was no longer a shrine, it was a place of business. She spent the rest of the day in the study, which she had one of the housekeepers clean. With the portraits gone, it was just a room with a desk. She sat behind that desk, her laptop open, and began the real work. She wasn't a rancher who had struck it rich. She was a businesswoman who knew ranching. She reviewed the company's financials, finding them in worse shape than she'd imagined. Covington had been running the empire into the ground for years, propping it up with loans and a reputation he hadn't earned. She made calls to agricultural suppliers, renegotiating contracts with the ruthless efficiency she'd learned in the tech world. She was transforming the Covington Cattle Company from a legacy into a modern, streamlined enterprise. The news of Arthur Covington working as a ranch hand on his own land hit the valley with the force of an earthquake. At the Dusty Saddle Saloon that evening, it was the only topic of conversation. The ranchers who had laughed at Joanna now spoke of her with a hushed, fearful respect. "Can you believe it? He's sleeping in the bunkhouse," one said, shaking his head. "I heard Bill gave him the job of cleaning out the stables this afternoon," another added. "She didn't just beat him, she broke him," a third concluded, looking around nervously as if Joanna herself might be listening. "She's playing a different game. This ain't about cattle anymore." The next morning, before the sun had fully risen, the ranch hands gathered in the yard for their daily assignments from Bill. They were a mix of curious, nervous, and excited. The pay raise had secured their loyalty, but the new reality was still sinking in. Arthur Covington stood among them, off to the side. He was wearing borrowed work clothes that didn't fit right and boots that were scuffed and worn by another man's labor. He avoided eye contact, staring at the dirt. Bill, trying to keep his voice steady, read off the list of tasks. "Johnson, Miller, you're with the herd in the south pasture. Davis, check the pump at the new well." He paused, taking a deep breath before the final assignment. "Arthur, you're on fence duty. Section 7, by the ridge. The wire is down in 3 places." It was the exact job he had mocked Joanna for. Mending fences. The lowest, most solitary work on the ranch. A murmur went through the other hands, but no one dared to laugh. Covington flinched as if he'd been struck, but he just gave a single jerky nod. He turned without a word and walked toward the supply shed to get the tools. From the window of her new office, the study, Joanna watched him go. She saw the slumped shoulders, the shuffling walk of a man who had lost everything. Her revenge was complete. She had taken his land, his name, his pride, and his house. Now, every sunrise would be a reminder of his fall. She felt a grim satisfaction, but it was fleeting. The past was settled. Now, she had an empire to run. Weeks turned into a month. The initial shockwave that Joanna had sent through the valley began to settle into a new, strange reality. The Covington Cattle Company was no more. In its place, a new entity was rising, one built on efficiency, respect, and the quiet, unyielding will of its new owner. Joanna didn't move into the master suite of the mansion. She continued to live in her grandfather's small cabin, using the opulent house only as the ranch's headquarters. The grand living room became a briefing area, and the formal dining room was converted into a logistics office with maps and charts on the walls. She was systematically stripping the house of its identity as a home and forging it into a tool. For Arthur Covington, each day was a lesson in a life he had only ever looked down upon. His hands, once soft and accustomed to holding nothing heavier than a whiskey glass, were now a raw, blistered mess. Mending fences under the harsh Montana sun was followed by hauling feed, cleaning troughs, and every other menial task Bill could find for him. At first, the other ranch hands watched him with a mix of curiosity and morbid satisfaction. But soon, they simply began to ignore him. He became what Joanna once was, a part of the scenery, a silent figure performing the thankless jobs that kept the massive operation running. He rarely spoke, and when he did, it was only to acknowledge an order. The fire of his rage had dwindled into the dull, cold embers of resignation. Joanna, meanwhile, was thriving. She was in her element, not just as a boss, but as an innovator. One afternoon, she gathered the entire crew, including a reluctant Covington, in the newly repurposed briefing room. She unveiled a series of schematics on a large monitor. "This is the system I developed," she explained, her voice resonating with passion. "Soil moisture sensors, GPS trackers for the herds, and drone surveillance for monitoring pasture health and locating stray cattle. Over the next 6 months, we're going to install this across the entire property, including Whispering Creek." She wasn't just giving orders, she was teaching. She explained how the technology would reduce their workload, increase efficiency, and improve the health of the cattle. The crew was captivated. They were used to Covington's vague, arrogant commands. This was different. This was a leader who understood the work from the ground up and had a clear vision for the future. They saw not just a new boss, but a better one. A few days later, Joanna was out on an ATV inspecting the fence line in Section 7, the one Covington had been assigned to repair his first week. She found a section where the wire was already sagging. She saw him working a few hundred yards away, tamping new posts into the hard ground. She drove over and killed the engine. He didn't look up until she was standing right beside him. "You didn't stretch the wire tight enough here," she said, her tone factual, not accusatory. "It needs to have almost no give, or the cattle will push right through it." He finally looked at her, his face a mask of sweat and dirt. "I did it the way I was told," he mumbled. "Then you were told wrong," she replied. She took the fence stretcher from his hands. "My grandfather taught me. You anchor it, give it 3 hard cranks and listen for the hum, like a guitar string. That's when you know it's right." She demonstrated, the wire groaning as it tightened, finally emitting a low, resonant hum in the quiet air. She handed the tool back to him. "Do the rest like that." She turned and walked away without another word. The lesson wasn't just about fencing. It was another quiet, brutal reminder that her knowledge of this land was earned in her blood, while his was merely inherited and superficial. The following week, Joanna called another all-hands meeting at the main gate. A new, professionally made sign was leaning against one of the stone pillars covered by a tarp. "There's one last piece of business," she announced to the assembled crew. "A name should reflect the work and the people who do it, not just one family." She pulled the tarp away. The new sign was made of solid, dark wood with clean, modern lettering. It read, "Williams Land and Cattle." The Covington name was gone, erased from the land it had defined for nearly a century. The crew broke into spontaneous applause. It was a symbolic end to an era of fear and the beginning of something new. Off to the side, Arthur Covington stood frozen. He stared at the sign, at the name that had replaced his. It was in that moment that he truly understood the totality of his defeat. She hadn't just taken his company, she had taken his history. He was no longer Arthur Covington, the powerful rancher. He was just Arthur, a hired hand working on Williams' land. The seasons began to turn. The relentless heat of the Montana summer gave way to the crisp, cold air of autumn. The ranch, now officially Williams' Land and Cattle, was running with a disciplined rhythm it had never known under Covington. Profits were up, the cattle were healthier, and the morale of the crew was high. Joanna had proven to be a demanding but fair boss. She worked as hard as any of them, her hands remaining calloused, her boots perpetually dusty. The revenge she had sought was complete, but she found that the satisfaction was less in Covington's fall and more in the success she was building on the ruins of his legacy. Arthur Covington had become a ghost on the ranch. He did his work with a mechanical, sullen efficiency. He took his meals alone in the bunkhouse and spoke to no one unless it was to receive an order from Bill. The physical labor had hardened his body, stripping away the softness of his former life. He was leaner, weathered, but his eyes remained empty. He was a man serving a life sentence, trapped in the one place he couldn't bear to be, yet couldn't bring himself to leave. He was a living monument to his own failure, and Joanna made sure he was always there to see what she was building. Then the first snow of the season came early, a sudden violent blizzard that swept down from the north with unexpected fury. It wasn't a gentle dusting, it was a whiteout, a wall of wind and ice that blanketed the valley in hours. Joanna was in the main office tracking the storm on her laptop when Bill burst in, his face grim, snow melting on his shoulders. "It's the herd in the North Canyon," Bill said without preamble. "About 300 head. We were scheduled to move them down to the low pastures tomorrow, but this storm came in too fast. They'll be snowed in within a few hours. If we don't get them out now, we'll lose them all." Joanna stood up, her mind racing. The North Canyon was the most treacherous part of the entire property, a maze of narrow ravines and steep, rocky ridges. "What's the safest route in this weather?" she asked, pulling up a satellite map of the area. Bill shook his head. "There isn't one. Not on any map anyway. The main trail will be impassable, drifted over. There are old cattle trails, shortcuts through the rocks, but only one person ever used them. Old man Harrison Covington taught them to Arthur. No one else has been up there in 20 years. The room went silent. The fate of a multi-million-dollar herd rested on the knowledge of the one man she had systematically broken. The irony was as bitter as the wind howling outside. For all her technology and business acumen, she was powerless without the one thing she couldn't buy: the inherited, intimate knowledge of this land that resided in her enemy's head. "Get 2 of our best horses saddled and ready," Joanna commanded. "Pack for a 12-hour ride, emergency supplies, flares, everything." "Who's riding with you?" Bill asked, though he already knew the answer. "The only one who can," she said, her jaw tight. She found Arthur in the stables, forking hay into a stall. The wind rattled the barn doors. He didn't acknowledge her presence until she was standing directly in front of him. He slowly leaned the pitchfork against the wall and looked at her, his expression a flat, unreadable mask. "There's a herd trapped in the North Canyon," she stated, forgoing any pleasantries. "The main trail is blocked. I need you to guide me through the old trails to get them out." Arthur was silent for a long moment. A slow, cold smile touched his lips for the first time in months. It was a terrible, joyless expression. My, he said softly, his voice rusty from disuse. "The great Joanna Williams, the tech genius, the business titan, needs help from the lowly ranch hand." He savored the moment. "And why exactly should I help you save your cattle?" "They'll die if we don't," she said, keeping her voice even, refusing to let him see her desperation. "They're your assets, your problem." "Not mine," he shot back, the old arrogance flaring in his eyes. "Let them freeze. It would be a fitting end to your little venture." Joanna took a step closer. She wasn't his boss now. She was a rancher facing a crisis. "This isn't about me, and it isn't about you," she said, her voice dropping, becoming intense. "This is about the land. It's about the herd. You spent your whole life on this ranch, acting like a king. You know that canyon better than any map. Are you going to let a piece of your own history die on that mountain out of spite?" Her words hit a nerve he thought was long dead. He wasn't the king anymore, but he had been. That land, those canyons, they were his. The idea of a herd freezing to death in Covington territory, even if it was no longer his name on the gate, was an offense to the only thing he had left, his memory of what he once was. He stared past her, out the barn door into the swirling white chaos. He was being offered a choice, not to be the boss again, but to be something more than a ghost, to be necessary. "I'll need my father's old coat," he said, his voice flat. "The heavy shearling one. It's in the cedar closet at the back of the mansion." It was a small, petty demand, a test. He was forcing her to retrieve a piece of his old life from the house he was banished from. Joanna didn't hesitate. "I'll get it," she said. Meet me at the main stable in 15 minutes. As she turned to leave, he spoke one last time. You should know, he said, his voice a low warning, that canyon doesn't forgive mistakes. Not for anyone. She walked out into the storm, the wind tearing at her. She had won the war, but now she had to ride into a blizzard with the one man who had every reason to want her to fail. A man whose knowledge was the only thing that could save them both. The air in the stable was thick with tension and the smell of wet leather. Arthur was already there, astride a powerful-looking gelding. He wore the heavy, shearling coat, its collar turned up against the cold. It was his father's coat, from a time when the Covington name meant something. It was like watching a ghost put on old skin. He looked down at Joanna from the saddle, his expression unreadable in the dim light. He was no longer just a ranch hand. He was the guide, the one holding the key. The power dynamic had been inverted by the storm. Stay close, he said, his voice a low growl barely audible over the wind. Don't let your horse choose its own path. Make it follow mine. Exactly. Joanna simply nodded, swinging herself onto her own horse. She had the coat he'd demanded slung over her saddle. She didn't offer it to him. He didn't ask again. They rode out of the relative calm of the stables and into the teeth of the blizzard. The world disappeared. Visibility dropped to a few feet, a swirling vortex of white. The wind was a physical force, pushing against them, trying to tear them from their saddles. Snow collected on their hats and shoulders, turning them into moving effigies of ice. Arthur rode ahead, a dark shape hunched against the storm. He wasn't following a trail. He was reading the land itself, sensing the subtle shifts in terrain beneath the deepening snow. Joanna, a skilled rider herself, found herself completely dependent on the man in front of her. Every instinct told her to turn back, but she pushed it down, her eyes locked on the silhouette of her guide. An hour into the ascent, they reached a narrow ridge. On one side was a rock wall, on the other, a sheer, invisible drop. The wind was trying to peel them off the mountain. Suddenly, Joanna's horse screamed, a high, terrified sound that was snatched away by the wind. Its front legs plunged through a snowdrift into nothing. It scrambled, its back hooves sliding on the slick rock, threatening to pull them both over the edge. Joanna reacted instantly, throwing her weight back, pulling hard on the reins to keep the horse's head up. But it wasn't enough. The animal was panicking. Before she could even shout, Arthur was off his own horse. He moved with a speed and purpose she hadn't seen in him since the day she took his life away. He didn't shout her name. He shouted at the horse, a sharp, authoritative command. He grabbed the bridle, his face inches from the animal's terrified eyes, and pulled, using his own body as an anchor against the abyss. "Easy now! Hold!" he roared into the storm. Together they fought the horse's panic, hauling and guiding it back onto solid ground. They stood there for a moment, chests heaving, the horse trembling between them. Neither of them spoke. There was no time for thanks or acknowledgement. He simply got back on his horse and pushed forward. But something had shifted. He had reacted not to save her, but to save the horse, to complete the mission. It was the instinct of a true rancher, an instinct that ran deeper than his hatred for her. They found the herd huddled in a small box-shaped canyon, just as Bill had predicted. They were dark, miserable shapes against the snow, already half buried in drifts. The low, mournful sound of freezing cattle was the only thing that broke the howl of the wind. They were running out of time. "We have to get them moving now, or they'll never get up," Joanna yelled over the gale. "They're spooked! They won't move into the storm!" Arthur yelled back. They tried to push the herd from behind, but the cattle just milled in a tight, panicked circle. They were choosing to die where they stood rather than face the blizzard. Joanna's heart sank. Her technology, her money, her plans, all of it was useless against 300 terrified animals. Arthur dismounted and waded into the snow, moving toward the front of the herd. He stopped before the lead steer, a massive, formidable animal. He closed his eyes for a second, as if reaching for a distant memory. Then he let out a sound. It wasn't a shout or a command. It was a low, guttural call that seemed to come from the land itself, a sound of reassurance and promise that cut through the noise of the storm. It was a call his father had used, and his grandfather before him. One of the old steers lifted its heavy head, its ice-caked ears twitching. It looked at Arthur. He made the sound again. The steer took a hesitant step forward, then another. It turned, its massive body pushing a path through the snow. The rest of the herd, sensing the shift, began to follow. Arthur got back on his horse, his face grim. "Let's go," he ordered. "Don't push them too hard." The journey down would be twice as dangerous, a slow, treacherous procession of half-frozen animals through a blinding storm. But for the first time in months, they weren't boss and hand, victor and vanquished. They were two ranchers against the storm, their shared survival now inextricably linked. The descent was a slow-motion nightmare. Every step was a gamble against the hidden terrain. The herd, exhausted and cold, moved with a glacial slowness that was agonizing. Hours bled into one another, marked only by the shifting intensity of the wind. Arthur led with a grim focus, his knowledge of the land the only thing keeping them from walking off a cliff or into a snow-filled ravine. Joanna rode behind, herding the stragglers, her body numb with a cold that went bone-deep. They were less than a mile from the safety of the lower pastures when they came to a dead stop. The path ahead, a narrow pass between two towering rock formations known as the Stone Gates, was gone. In its place was a fresh rock slide, a massive jumble of snow-dusted boulders and debris completely blocking their way. The storm had shaken the mountain to its core. They were trapped. To go back was impossible. The herd was too weak to make the climb again. To stay meant freezing to death. Arthur dismounted, his movements stiff. He walked to the edge of the rockfall and stared at it, his shoulders slumping in defeat. "It's over," he said, his voice flat and dead. The mountains closed the door. He turned to face Joanna, a bitter, almost triumphant despair in his eyes. "Congratulations, Williams. You bought an empire, and now you get to watch it die on your first winter." Joanna slid off her horse, her legs nearly buckling from exhaustion. "There has to be another way." "There is no other way," he roared, the raw frustration of the last few months erupting. "This is it. Don't you get it? All your money, all your plans, the land doesn't care. It was here before my family, and it'll be here long after yours is a forgotten memory." "My grandfather wasn't a forgotten memory," Joanna shot back, her voice sharp as ice. "He worked this land. He loved it. He was promised a piece of Whispering Creek by your father for saving this entire ranch during the drought of '78, a promise that was broken the second your father died." Arthur stared at her, the wind whipping his hair. The story was a vague, half-forgotten piece of local law he'd always dismissed as the ramblings of a disgruntled worker. But hearing it from her, here at the end of everything, it landed with the force of a physical blow. "That's a lie," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Is it?" Joanna pressed, taking a step closer. "My grandfather died with nothing but the dirt under his fingernails and the memory of that broken promise. I didn't buy this ranch to build an empire, Covington. I bought it to reclaim a debt of honor. I did this for him." The revelation hung between them, more powerful than the storm. Arthur's entire worldview, built on the foundation of his family's inherent right to this land, cracked. He saw it all in a new, horrifying light. The dismissal of the Williams family, the casual cruelty, the arrogance. It was all built on a lie. He looked away from her, at the rocks blocking their path. He saw not an obstacle, but a tombstone for his family's name. But then a flicker of something else ignited within him, not pride, but knowledge. "The left side," he said, his voice a hoarse whisper. "There's a fissure behind that large boulder. My father showed it to me once. He said if the main pass ever collapsed, that was the weak point." Hope, sharp and painful, pierced through Joanna's exhaustion. "Can we move it?" "Not all of it," he said, his mind now working, the rancher's instinct taking over. "But maybe enough. We can clear a path just wide enough for one animal at a time. For the next hour, They worked in a silent, desperate frenzy. They used their saddle ropes as levers and their own freezing hands to pull away the smaller rocks. It was brutal, punishing work. They were no longer enemies. They were two people, a man and a woman, fighting a mountain for their lives. Finally, with a great groaning scrape, they managed to shift the key boulder just enough. A narrow, treacherous path was opened. Arthur, his hands bleeding, looked at Joanna. The hatred was gone from his eyes, replaced by a deep, weary understanding. "Get them through," he said. One by one, they guided the half-frozen cattle through the gap. As the last animal cleared the pass, the storm began to break. The wind died down, and through a tear in the clouds, a sliver of pale moonlight illuminated the valley below. They had made it. They had survived. They rode back to the main yard just as the first rays of dawn were breaking over the snow-covered peaks. They were silent, moving like ghosts, caked in ice and mud. Bill and the rest of the crew were waiting, their faces etched with worry. When they saw the herd trailing behind, exhausted but alive, a cheer went up. They had been preparing for a massive loss. Instead, they witnessed a miracle. Joanna and Arthur dismounted, their movements slow and pained. They didn't look at each other. Bill rushed over. "Joanna, are you all right? We were about to send a search party." "We're fine, Bill," she said, her voice hoarse. "Get the herd into the winter pasture. Make sure they have feed and heated water." She looked past him at Arthur, who was unsaddling his horse with methodical slowness. "And tell Arthur he's done for the day. He can take tomorrow off too." Arthur paused, his back to her. He didn't turn around or acknowledge the order. He just finished with his horse, handed the reins to a waiting ranch hand, and walked, stiff-legged, toward the bunkhouse without a word. The next morning, the sun shone brightly on a transformed world of white. Joanna was in her office, going over damage reports. There was a knock on the door. Arthur Covington stood there. He was clean-shaven, wearing fresh work clothes. He wasn't looking at her, but at a spot on the floor just past her desk. "I'm here to give my notice," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "I'll be gone by evening." Joanna leaned back in her chair, studying him. The arrogance was gone, but so was the defeated emptiness. In its place was something new, something quieter and more solid. "Where will you go?" she asked. He finally met her eyes. "Don't know, but I can't stay here. This is your land now. You've earned it." He paused, and the next word seemed to cost him more than all the money he had lost. "What you said on the mountain about your grandfather, was it true?" "Every word," Joanna said. He nodded slowly, a lifetime of certainty crumbling away. "My father, he wasn't a good man. I spent my life trying to be the powerful man he was. I think I just ended up being the worst parts of him." He looked around the office, the room that had been the seat of his power. "I don't know how to fix what my family did, but I can't be a part of it anymore." Joanna was silent for a long moment. Her revenge was complete. The man who had humiliated her was broken. His family's legacy was in ashes, and he was leaving with nothing. She had won. But looking at the man before her, she felt the grim satisfaction of her victory curdle into something else. It felt hollow. "I have a counteroffer," she said, her voice catching him by surprise. "The North Canyon. It's too rugged for large-scale grazing, and that rock slide has made it unstable. I'm legally required to deed 100 acres of it to a separate owner to manage as a conservation easement. Tax purposes." He stared at her, not understanding. 100 acres, she repeated, her voice steady. "The same amount your father promised my grandfather. It's the most remote, difficult part of the whole ranch. It'll be a hard life, but it's land. A man could build something there if he was willing to work." Arthur was speechless. She wasn't offering him a handout. She wasn't offering forgiveness. She was offering a chance to pay a debt that was a generation old. A chance to start over with nothing but his own two hands on a piece of the very land his family had stolen. "Why?" he finally managed to ask, his voice thick with emotion. My grandfather believed the land remembers who treats it right, Joanna said, standing up and walking to the window. I guess we'll see if he was right. Arthur Covington didn't accept right away. He walked out of the office and spent the rest of the day alone, wandering the lower pastures. The next morning, he didn't report for work. Instead, he went to see Bill and signed the deed. He was no longer a ranch hand on Williams' land. He was the owner of 100 acres of unforgiving rock and snow in the North Canyon. His new life, a life of real work, had just begun. Joanna stood on the porch of her grandfather's cabin, looking out at the vast, sprawling ranch under the Williams name. Her quest for revenge was over, but it had ended in a way she never expected. She hadn't just destroyed a man, she had perhaps given him a chance to be reborn. And in doing so, she had finally, truly honored her grandfather's memory. The land was in the right hands now, all of it. This story teaches us that true strength isn't about the land you inherit, but the character you build. It's about proving that dignity and hard work are more valuable than any fortune. Joanna didn't just buy a ranch. She reclaimed a legacy and rewrote the future of an entire valley, proving that justice sometimes is best served cold, but with a chance for redemption. What Joanna did next solidified her place not just as a landowner, but as a leader. She used her technological expertise to make Williams Land and Cattle a model of sustainable and efficient ranching. Her methods were studied by agricultural universities, and she created a scholarship program for local kids who wanted to study agriculture, ensuring the next generation would have opportunities her grandfather never did. The mansion was eventually converted into a community and research center, its opulent rooms now filled with students and scientists instead of the ghosts of a fallen dynasty. And Arthur Covington? He was rarely seen. He lived in a small, rough cabin he built himself on his 100 acres in the North Canyon. He didn't raise cattle. Instead, he worked tirelessly to reintroduce native plant species and manage the fragile ecosystem, slowly healing the land from decades of neglect. He became a quiet, solitary figure, a man atoning for his family's sins, not with words, but with the sweat of his brow and the calluses on his hands. He and Joanna never became friends. They never spoke again. But sometimes, from a high ridge, she would see the smoke from his chimney, and he would see the lights of the ranch headquarters in the valley below. An unspoken understanding existed between them, a shared respect forged in a blizzard on the edge of a mountain. The debt had been paid. Joanna Williams started as a humble cowgirl who was publicly humiliated, but she never lost sight of who she was or where she came from. She used her intelligence, her fortune, and her unwavering spirit to not only silence a bully, but to build something better in his place. She proved that the best revenge isn't just winning, it's creating a legacy of your own that completely eclipses the one that tried to hold you down. The land remembered who treated it right, and under Joanna's care, the entire valley flourished. This story shows that pride comes before a fall, and true worth is measured by your actions, not your name. If you were moved by Joanna's journey and believe in the power of justice, please like this video and subscribe to our channel for more stories that will touch your heart. Let us know what you thought in the comments. And if you made it this far, show your support by commenting, "I watched until the end." Thank you for joining us on this incredible journey. Click on the video on your screen now for another story you won't want to miss.